Hi, in this presentation, we're going to talk about cellular respiration in detail. So, I first want to propose the idea, the concept that's kind of unavoidable, in that there is this word respiration or to respire, and that is typically associated with breathing, in that air goes in, the oxygen is used by the lungs. CO2 comes out. But there's something deeper that's going on there, and that lies in our equation for cellular respiration and how that oxygen is used in cells with the presence of food to really create energy. And water is kind of a byproduct, and CO2 is that byproduct that gets exhaled. So, our big picture here is that really this is a gradual process, it's step by step. And there is anaerobic respiration as well as aerobic respiration. So anaerobic respiration, no oxygen is required. Aerobic respiration, oxygen is required. And there are three steps to cellular respiration. We have glycolysis, which happens in the cytoplasm, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain, which both happen inside the mitochondria. The equation itself is something that you really need to kind of commit to your biological memory, if you will, and as well as being able to describe it in using chemical formula, like our chemical symbols, but you should also know what those chemical symbols mean and be able to explain cellular respiration in words. By and large, the overall process is taking sugar or food and using that sugar or food to make ATP or cellular energy, but that is involving oxygen. And another big picture concept here, and I'm really throwing a lot of big ideas, big picture ideas here at you, is that the reactants of photosynthesis are the products of cellular respiration. So here are our reactants. Carbon dioxide and water. They go into plants with light and make sugar and oxygen, whereas sugar and oxygen go into a mitochondria and create ATP and release carbon dioxide and water. So the two processes are intertwined, but note that plants do cellular respiration. Animals do cellular respiration. Animals do not do photosynthesis. That is something that is unique to organisms that have chloroplasts. So, looking at glycolysis in a little bit more detail, the word glycolysis itself contains glyco, which would be often referring to glucose, and lysis, which means to break. So, that's really what is happening. This process is required for all of cellular respiration to proceed. So this is happening in the cytoplasm. Glucose gets broken down into two pyruvic acid molecules. Pyruvic acid is also known as pyruvate. This does not require any oxygen, hence it is an anaerobic process. A little bit of ATP is made, a little bit of NADH, which is another energy storing molecule, is made, but 90% of the chemical energy available from glucose is still unused. So there's a ton of energy that's being wasted if the next two steps do not occur. And the pyruvate, it just kind of sits there. So we don't really want that to happen, but in terms of net, what is happening here? There's a net of 2 ATP, 2 pyruvic acid, and 2 NADH molecules from glycolysis. That glucose, like I said, gets broken down to ATP are created in that process. That 3 carbon molecules, those are your pyruvate. The pyruvate then goes on to the Krebs cycle. So here we go. Here's our pyruvic acid. It's going into the matrix of the mitochondria. And in the Krebs cycle, the pyruvic acid itself is broken down further, releasing carbon dioxide. This is in the presence of oxygen to create a little bit of ATP. However, the main product of the Krebs cycle are additional molecules of NADH and FADH2, which are energy carrying molecules that will then fuel and go on to the electron transport chain. So again, here is our kind of unlabeled, if you will, mitochondria. Here's pyruvate going into the Krebs cycle, CO2 being released, and then here's our NADH and FADH2 going on to the electron transport chain. There really is a lot going on in the Krebs cycle that you are not required to know. It's also called the citric acid cycle, if you ever see that used. But again, we're getting a little bit of ATP, a little bit of NADH and FADH2, but that NADH and FADH2 are really necessary. They're required for the electron transport chain. So here we are. This is the electron transport chain. It's occurring in the mitochondria, particularly in the membrane, the inner membrane of the mitochondria. The oxygen that is required for this process enters and water is released. But there's some things that are happening here where the electrons from that NADH and FADH2, they get kind of passed along just like electrons in the electron transport chain in the light-dependent reaction occurs. The electrons are just coming from a different place. The NADH and FADH2 get reduced to a lower energy form. And as those electrons get passed along, here's our electrons getting passed along, the hydrogen ions are getting pumped into the inner membrane space. Eventually, those hydrogen ions diffuse through ATP synthase, producing a lot of ATP. So the key here is the role of oxygen in this process. So oxygen acts as what we call a final electron acceptor. So at the end of the electron transport chain, oxygen accepts the electrons, it grabs them in, and then it also snags some hydrogen ions and forms water. So if we go back here, this is our oxygen going in and our water coming out, because that water is the product at the very end of the electron transport chain. Again, those hydrogen ions then diffuse from that inner membrane space into the matrix, creating ATP. And we can see that again here. I really like this picture. Here's our NADH and FADH2 donating their electrons. They're getting passed along. Hydrogen's getting pulled across from the matrix to the inner membrane space. At the end of the flow here in the electron transport chain, oxygen accepts those electrons, snags some hydrogen, and water is created. And lastly, hydrogen ions diffuse through ATP synthase, adding a phosphate to ADP, creating the energy storing molecule ATP, which acts as cellular fuel. So from glycolysis, we get about 6 ATP, 6 to 8, and then from the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, we get 30 to 32, depending on the efficiency. And the grand total of ATP made from cellular respiration from beginning to end, 1 molecule of glucose through glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain creates 36 to 38 molecules of ATP. And, at the end here, you really want to go through, maybe review the presentation and see if you can answer these questions on your own. Thanks so much.